Hello, everyone. Today I am putting on a different hat um, to talk with you about compassion. And yeah, I also wear this blanket because it is a little bit cold, and I just put this blanket around me because it makes me feel nice and warm. Um, but I have written something about compassion on my blog, which you can read, and I'm going to read that to you, so that you can sort of put together the person who writes all this, if you ever get the chance to read my blog, with the person who says this, with the person who sounds like this. Because, yeah, embodied language that I talk about, of course, is about how you sound when you speak and how you can hear your own sound while you speak. And the compassion that is a natural aspect of embodied language deals with your ability to stop your disembodied language. So if that wasn't the case, there would be no compassion. Anyway, I'm going to read to you my writing, in which I will speak with you about somebody by the name of J. Krishnamurti. I've listened to him a great deal, and I have felt very inspired by his words, because he did not create a following. He was actually always speaking about consciousness and meditation and stuff like that. But since I have my own views, I have to, on the one hand, agree with him, but on the other hand, also disagree with him. And so that is also why I want to make this video, so that you can also hear where that is coming from and how that actually is necessary to disagree with Krishnamurti or with any other so-called enlightened person. Because I speak about a different kind of enlightenment, which I call language enlightenment. Okay, here we go. Compassion. For the purpose of illustrating what I want to say about compassion, I will first bring the reader this quote from J. Krishnamurti. He says, "Compassion is not a sentiment. Compassion is not woolly or empathy. It is not something you can cultivate through thought, discipline, control, suppression, being kind, polite, gentle, or all the rest of it. It only comes into being when thought at the very root has come to an end." Krishnamurti, unknowingly, was his whole life referring to embodied language, which is, of course, the expression of our language enlightenment. I hope you are able to combine his words with what I say about our disembodied language, which creates and maintains the illusion of thought. The absence of compassion isn't due to the presence of thought or a mind, because a thought or a mind doesn't exist, even though we all talk like that, due to the way in which we deal with our language. Our disembodied language creates all of our problems, as it makes us believe that language can happen inside of us. Krishnamurti's words require some translation to the concept of disembodied language, embodied language, and language enlightenment. He often stated that thought is time born of experience and knowledge, which are inseparable from time and past. However, the fallacy of covert, supposedly inner language, of being able to have thoughts, or presumably of having a mind of our own, has distracted us from paying attention to the overt behaviors which determine how we deal with language. 1. Speaking. 2. Listening. 3. Writing. And 4. Reading. Moreover, all other good as well as bad behavior is kept going by the way in which we deal with our language, and not by some superstitious fantasy which inevitably occurs since we cannot speak appropriately about our own experience. Our disembodied language always distorts our own experience, and therefore we can never talk effectively about our own experience, which of course happens in the here and now. With embodied language, we can, for the first time in human history, talk without any hesitation, distraction, or distortion. Talk with total awareness about our direct own experience. And this is how we acquire real self-knowledge, which is grounded in our own experience in the here and now. We can finally talk wholeheartedly about our past as well as about our future, because our embodied language keeps us present. In disembodied language, by contrast, we dissociate from our experience because we feel threatened. It isn't, as Krishnamurti says, time which is the psychological enemy of men, but it is the constant threat which we experience while we speak. We have never been in a non-threatening situation in which we could continuously, consciously have embodied language. In embodied language, our action is based not on knowledge of the past, but on self-knowledge, accurate self-knowledge in the here and now, with hearing, here and now. Therefore, we are not limited by our unfulfilled desire to express who we really are. And who we really are is, of course, our language enlightenment. Fascinatingly, Krishnamurti described his state of mind as a young boy, when he wasn't yet fully conditioned by this embodied language, as follows. He said, "No thought entered his mind. He was just watching, listening, nothing else. Thought and its associations never even arose. There was no image making. He often even attempted to think, but no thought would come." You can tell from his words that thought, and even the so-called mind itself, was only just a verbal product which arose from the associations and the image making of our usual disembodied language. Our fantasy of having thoughts or a mind, which probably has been going on ever since human beings became verbal, will only come to an end when we make the individual shift from our disembodied language to our embodied language. Nobody can do this for us, but we can definitely do this for ourselves. After all, embodied language is a skill which can, and in my opinion, should be acquired. Once we have this marvelous ability to have ongoing embodied language, we will step out of our dreadful history of conditioning with disembodied language. In effect, our thought doesn't really come to an end because we fully understand that it never really even existed. I totally agree with Krishnamurti that compassion doesn't come from charitable acts or social reform, but I disagree with him that compassion has to be free from sentiment, from romanticism or emotional enthusiasm. As anyone who knows anything about embodied language will agree, the accurate expression of our feelings is of utmost importance, as this and this alone guarantees the continuation of our embodied language. In essence, our sentiments always reflect our experience of whether we feel safe or threatened. The fact that we are incapable of talking about it with our disembodied language makes it seem as if there's something wrong with our emotions, but we cannot reason properly as long as we do not feel safe. The accurate expression of our emotion is of course not the same as emotional idealism or nostalgia, which also derives from the fact that we are incapable of really talking about our feelings. Our attitude or judgment about the situation that we find ourselves in is determined by the perception which is afforded by our disembodied language or our embodied language, by the way in which we deal with our language. Yeah? In disembodied language, language is just happening to us. But in embodied language, we are in control of our language. We behave our language. Although in disembodied language we often react to each other and we often attack each other, it is primarily, of course, a defensive mechanism because we feel threatened. I also want to say a few words about romanticism, which Krishnamurti criticized, or which he says has nothing to do with compassion. In the context of the fact that individuals historically have been punished, killed, tortured, or imprisoned for not adhering to the group behavior which was culturally required to survive, it is very important to recognize that romanticism is marked by its focus on the individual. Surely, this focus was and is not perfect, but it certainly has given birth to societies in which individuals have rights and freedoms. It is therefore not a bad thing, in my opinion, to be reminded of the historical literary movement called Romanticism, which was about the unique perspective of a person, often guided by irrational and emotional impulses. Of course, they are guided by irrational and perhaps convoluted emotional impulses because there was no embodied language to express themselves. Furthermore, it would really help us to be more romantic, to have respect for nature, the so-called primitive, and to celebrate the common man. Since we have never had ongoing embodied language, there was no way for us to talk sensitively, sensibly, intelligently, and therefore since we have never had ongoing embodied language, there was no way for us to talk sensitively, sensibly, and intelligently. However, romanticism surely was a movement to elaborate on that, albeit embracing, the isolation and melancholy that comes with the fact that we do not have the language to do that. Yeah. It is a reinterpretation of our history which occurs with our embodied language. Lastly, anyone with embodied language immediately feels a sense of emotional enthusiasm because our embodied language expresses effortlessly, happily, our language enlightenment, which is who we really are. In closing, embodied language makes us naturally acknowledge that we are sensitive individuals who experience and celebrate the abundant positive energy of our language enlightenment. It is foolish, in my opinion, of Krishnamurti to compare our compassion with a great immovable rock in the midst of confusion, misery, and anxiety. The new culture which Krishnamurti was talking about could not come about as long as disembodied language remained unaddressed. He did not address our disembodied language in the way I do. I already live in that culture. I live in that culture in which disembodied language has been addressed and therefore is left behind. I speak to you right now, and this is not what I wrote, I just say that just spontaneously. I speak to you with my embodied language for my language enlightenment. Yeah. So I already live in that culture which I create for myself and which each of us can only create for ourselves. I'm not waiting for anyone, but if you manage to stop your disembodied language, I will be delighted to talk with you. I agree with my old friend Krishnamurti that compassion and intelligence go hand in hand, but they only do so in embodied language. The wholeness of life, or our language enlightenment, is only articulated by our embodied language. Okay, now that was it.